Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Phil Searle. He's the founding managing director of Chazey Partners Limited, and he has over 25 years of experience in finance, shared services, technology, and outsourcing. And then he's asked me not to read all this stuff. He just wants to be introduced. He's had jobs as a controller with small companies like
Three commas down the road.
And he's also right now, he's done work with various of the UCs, and right now you're working, I think, with San Francisco and UC Path and others, and he's worked with Berkeley and others. Actually, he was a key speaker at the last conference, and we were having the conference this year. We knew we needed to bring him back. He has a great perspective, and he's going to explode those myths of shared services, and we're looking forward to the talk. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mike. Good morning, everybody. I have another funny accent, if you hadn't noticed. Thank you very much, Mike, Kathy, and everybody else for inviting me to come back and speak. As Mike said, I spoke last year at your UCCSU conference on shared services, and I've been asked back, so obviously I said something okay. So this particular session, I've got an hour and 15 minutes. We'll see how it goes. Take questions at the end. That's fine. But it's entitled "Exploding the Myths of Shared Services," and that's basically a title that Mike and I discussed. Because what is this thing called shared services? It's been around for a long time, and I'm going to be talking today about some of the trends, but trying to also explain what this thing is, because it's often misdefined, misunderstood, misrepresented, implemented incorrectly, and then blamed for failure. So I'm going to be talking a lot about that. So some of the successes, some of the failures, what it is, what it isn't, that sort of thing. I'm going to be talking about today. So I'll talk briefly about me and Chazey, then move on. Then some of the myths. Then I'm going to talk about global trends, what's going on in the world of shared services in general, in both the private and the public sector. Then I'm going to focus a little bit about the public sector. Now, when I say public sector, just for definitional purposes, I mean government, federal, local, state, higher education, mainly state funded, but higher education in general, and healthcare, mainly public funded. So when I say public sector, that's what I mean by that. And then we're going to talk about some shared services trends, specifically in the public sector and then in higher education. So we'll get into a little bit more detail on what's been going on in higher ed for the last 10 years or so. And then I'll move more into some sort of best practices, critical success factors for how you implement shared services for your organization, and then some winning strategies, which I also call sometimes tips and tricks, which is some of the things I've learned myself from doing this. As Mike mentioned, I'm not a shared service, I'm not a consultant by birth, thank God. I'm actually a practitioner, so I was the controller at 3Com down in Santa Clara for 5 years. Do you remember 3Com? Yeah, invented Ethernet in 1979. That wasn't me. I joined them in 1998, and I was with them until 2003, so that included the Palm spin-off. Do you remember the Palm handheld device? Do you remember the lunacy of March 2000? Palm was valued second only to Chevron for about 5 minutes that day. And that's true, look it up. And then it just went way down. So that was 3Com. I was with them for, as part of my role though, we actually implemented shared services, 52 countries around the world on an SAP platform for finance, and then we expanded that to HR, did one alongside, and we also did it for procurement. And IT, we did a big ERP implementation. After 3Com, just a small background, I went back to England, and I worked for a company called Cendant. Cendant actually doesn't exist as an independent company now, but it owned Avis Budget, Century 21, Coldwell Banker, and a bunch of travel businesses, eBookers, Orbitz.com, these websites. So I was the CFO of the international travel business. The point is, getting to the point, is shared services I sort of learned through my career as a way of helping me and us to achieve our objectives. Wasn't something I was born with, if you see what I mean. It became something we used a lot, and I really got passionate about it. And I've been speaking at conferences about shared services now for 16 years. First time I spoke was 1998. And so for much of that time, I was actually a practitioner. I wasn't a consultant, I was a practitioner. So it's a topic that I really get quite excited about. We'll see what happens today. So this is what I'm going to be talking about. Okay, I've just talked about that. So Chazey, just very briefly, I actually founded Chazey 8 years ago actually above my garage back in Reading, UK, when I left Sendon. And really it's because I was really quite passionate about this topic, and I thought I might as well get paid for talking about it. So I set up a consulting firm, and since then we've expanded globally. I'm actually based back here in California now. The office is in Campbell, but I live in Los Gatos. For you local people, you'll know where that is. Great part of the world, but I travel extensively. I'm one of those crazy global services flyers. Yeah, we do shared services, technology, etc. The one thing I wanted to show you on here is just briefly some of our clients. You'll see there's a mix in here. You've got private sector, public sector, higher ed. So you got in higher ed, you've got Mike mentioned this, UC Path, UCSF, Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratories. Anybody from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab here? No. Yes. So we help with your HR shared services. You guys done a great job in HR shared services. We came in a couple of years ago and reviewed it and helped with the strategy going forward. And you can see National University Ireland in Galway, which is the university in Galway in Ireland. So there's a mix there in the government. You've got the government of New Brunswick in Canada. You've got the Department of Health and Human Services. We help them with their PS Program Support Center. So there's a real mix in the public sector and a bunch of private sector names like Coca-Cola Enterprises. You heard of them? Coca-Cola is actually a whole different number of companies, for those of you who don't know. There's Coca-Cola main company in Atlanta, which really does the branding and looks after the ingredients and the global marketing. And they have a bunch of sales and distribution businesses, franchises around the world. Coca-Cola Enterprises, the reason why I'm dwelling on that is because I often get the comment from people in the public sector, in higher ed, oh, you don't know what it's like in higher ed, in the public sector. It's not like the private sector, right? That is true, absolutely true. But I can also tell you there are many private sector organizations out there, like that one, where it's almost like working in the public sector. People have been there 25 years, 30 years, change is really difficult. Culture's very siloed, very restrictive. You have very collaborative, which means you have to talk to a lot of people before you do anything. All that sort of thing. So while some private sector organizations, top-down driven organizations, that is not always the case. And CCE, Coca-Cola Enterprises, is one example of where it's actually, I almost think it's worse in the public sector in certain instances because of the nature of collaboration. They've actually come a long, long way since then, CCE, and it's a great story, but there are examples between the two organizations. Okay, so let's get into the topic. This thing called shared services. One of the most important things is you need to define it. I've seen presentations or moves forward shared services, it's not defined. Okay, it's just this thing. And it's what I call the CEO on the aeroplane scenario. You know, well, not so much these days because you've got wireless on the aeroplane these days, which can be rather annoying. Especially, anyway, the days when you couldn't use the phone and you couldn't use wireless on the aeroplane, right? What did you do? You either watched a film, if you're into films, or sometimes you read the magazine in the front pocket. Dangerous, right? Because what I mean by the CEO, this sort of happened to me back at 3Com. The CEO sort of read an article on, actually the CFO, read an article on shared services. They come back and say, hey Phil, you know that shared services thing you keep banging on about? Sounds great. I want you to implement it everywhere tomorrow and save me 30%. And when you're done, give me a shout. Right? I'm not exaggerating too much, but I am exaggerating a bit, but not a lot. This happens a lot. So this thing about shared, when I joined Sendon as CFO, right? So I'm responsible for the business unit, for the CFO business unit. I'm responsible for all finance. So that's, treasury, finance, decision support, back office, AP, etc. And one thing I was told when I joined Sendon was, hey, Phil, don't worry about the back office. We've got this thing called shared services. Now, I've been doing shared services for quite a long time before then, so I said, great. That's good. That means I can focus on, the business partnering, mergers and acquisitions, all that sort of stuff. Well, that wasn't what actually happened. What actually happened at Sendon was, in this particular part of the business unit, is really would somebody had come in and said, shared services is a great thing, right? This is finance in Sendon, my business unit. You lot are called shared services. You lot are called business partners. You lot are fired. This is private sector, right? hard and fast. But they hadn't actually ever defined what shared services meant. They never defined what business partnering meant, and you guys were gone anyway, so it didn't matter anymore, right? So to the company. And so I went in, and the first thing, everybody was complaining, all the general managers, all the sales guys, all the operations guys, this shared services thing is a disaster, it's a mess. You need to sort it out. I was like, whoa, hold on a second, I only started yesterday. No, seriously, you've got to sort this out. So we had to go back to first principles, is my point, and I'll talk about that, and redefine it. I had to hire somebody who actually knew what shared services was about, and we had to train people, we had to set up structures, and I'll talk about that. So bottom line is, shared services is an expression I've used many times. Shared services is not shared services just because you call it so. Okay? Very important. Keep that in mind. So what is it then? Okay, this is the definition. Lady in marketing put this on a fancy slide, but the bottom line is shared services, and you can use your definition however you like, but shared services is an organization that employs a specialist team, i.e. the people who provide the shared services do something different, right? They're specialized. They're doing something different to the way it was always done before. If the people just do everything the way it was always done before, you get the way it was always done before, right? So you have to be different. To be specialist, though, what does that mean? To be specialist, you have to have a slightly different mindset, but then you have to be trained, you have to be supported, educated, continuous improvement, all those things. So it's a different way of doing things, specialist team. Geographically unconstrained. What does that mean? It means not sitting right next to the customer, the internal customer. In the old school, and you absolutely guys have it in the university system, you have it in the public sector a lot, and you still have it, you might not think so, but in the private sector a lot, that, oh, my support, Janet or John, sits down the hall from me. So if I have a problem in accounts payable or payroll or recruitment or whatever it might be, I just wander down the hall and say, hey, Janet, can you help me with this? Right? That's the old way of doing things. Shared services is geographically unconstrained. So, I mean, in the extreme example, and by the way, I don't necessarily recommend this, in the extreme example, you have accounts payable or payroll supported for somebody in the United States out of a location like India, right? You've all seen that as an example. But the point is, it doesn't have to be. It just doesn't have to be right next door. It's just geographically unconstrained. I remember when I went to Lawrence Berkeley Lab, National Lab, the first time I went there, I thought, it's only one campus, can't be that big a deal. It's all, however many square miles it is. My God, was I wrong? I mean, moving from one building to the next was honestly like moving from one sort of organization to another. So the geographically unconstrained bit meant literally walking 5 minutes down the road. Now, so the point is, we were trying to, in a way, and obviously the HR shared services team had already done this to an extent, have services provided from a different building on the same campus. That still applies, the geographically unconstrained. It's moving to a different location, okay? And by the way, be careful, that doesn't mean everything moves to the different location, and I'll come back to that later on. And client focus, client, customer, you can use whatever terminology you like. Client's just a phrase we tend to see used more often in public sector, but use whatever you like. It's the internal customer, internal client, the employee. Largely it's the employee base, it's the business units, it's the organizations, it's the regional teams, it's the sales structures, it's the R&D, it's in your business. Who are your internal clients in higher education? It's your professors, researchers, it's your academic support staff, right? That's your internal client. I haven't got it on there, but if I ever get asked, it's the old elevator speech. Somebody grabs you an elevator and says, hey, what's that shared services thing again? What is it? If you've only got one sentence to say, it's a lot more than this, but I try and say this one thing. Shared services is about treating your internal client or customer as if they were an external client. That's the mindset, right? So if you think about that, if you only got one sentence you can say, that's the one I like to recommend. There's a lot more to it, but use that one. Okay, providing services that are, you've got to achieve all of these things. High quality, efficient, lower cost, and I'll come back to these. And repetitive or professional. Repetitive means, historically speaking, it's the more transactional repetitive processes that can go into shared services and or outsourcing. right? The AP, the payroll, the AR, as you move into these areas, requisitioning, simple requisitioning, anything to do with an admin transactional process that supports the business as a non-core service would traditionally go in first. However, over time, things have gone what we call up the value chain. So you get more professional. That's what professional means, professional and technical. So things like procurement, sourcing. In the finance area, you might have some of the data analytics stuff that we heard on this morning. Some of that will be done more from a centralized perspective. Not necessarily a shared service center, but more centralized. That's what that means. And lower cost is important in the middle. I'm going to come back to cost. But ultimately, at the end of whatever day you're working, if you can't deliver these services to your internal client at least as cheap, in inverted commas, or efficiently, as they did before, don't bother. See, unless you can be more efficient, if you can't be more efficient, then why are you making it, in theory, more difficult for your client? So you need to make it more efficient. Now, does that happen immediately? No, you get all these J-curves of, costs go up and down. But that's what I mean by the word ultimately. Ultimately, if you can't be more efficient in delivering these services through a shared services structure, leave it alone. There are reasons why you can't be: culture, poor technology, not ready for it. Some other major thing happens in your organization that stops that happening. So, but ultimately, if you can't do it more efficiently, don't. Non-core, mission critical. Non-core means, i.e., it's not core to your key enterprise. So, for example, in higher education, your core mission is to educate, research, right? Educate students, to provide research to your, and do research into new areas. That's your core mission, correct? It's not to process accounts payable invoices. It's not to process payroll. It's not to do car park maintenance, right? That's not your core mission in the business. Shared services, in theory, can do all that other stuff, the non-core stuff, in theory. But it is mission critical. So without these back office support services, it doesn't matter how good your front office is, as we call it, your core mission, your organization will fail if you have poor back office, right? There are numerous examples in the private sector of organizations that have literally gone out of business because their back office did not work. So why I say non-core but mission critical, there was a trend with outsourcing. Remember this outsourcing thing that's still around, of course, but there was a trend that almost made it sound like it wasn't important. Oh, this back office stuff, ship it overseas, ship it to an outsourcer, not important, not strategic. That might be true to an extent, but it absolutely is important, and it absolutely is mission critical. So don't treat it that way. And that's also good for your employees in shared services. Remind them that actually what they do is mission critical. You provide a service to your organization. And one of the great things about internal shared services versus outsourcing, you are all part of the same organization. That's a value. There are some challenges with that, but that's the value. We're all in it together. We're all the mission for the university. Okay. And there are a whole bunch of ways of achieving it, organizational realignment, etc. I'll come back to some of those. What's the difference between shared services and centralization? Centralization is that classic old school corporate centralized, some of you may have heard you say this before. You get this cycle of central, decentral, right? And universities have been going through this recently. So when things are going well, whatever that means, lots of money, everybody's happy, economy's growing, you tend to decentralize. Same in the private sector. You let the universities, the campuses, the business units, the countries, hey, do your own thing, everybody's happy, loads of money, no worries, things are going well, let's leave it to you. What happens when something goes wrong? That thing going wrong could be you run out of money, funding, recession, funding cuts. There could be a control environment issue. Oh my God, did we really do that out in that business unit or that campus? Then what happens? You centralize everything. You bring it under corporate. And you say, whew, that's good. We've got it under control now. But all the campuses, the business units, the departments, they don't like being under control necessarily of central. So over time, when things start to get better, you decentralize again. And this is this cycle of central, centralized, decentralized, that if done properly, shared services breaks that cycle. And I'll come back to why. So here are some of the, I'll zip down these, but shared services in the middle, centralization on the right. Accountability, ultimately shared services should be accountable to its customer, right? Which is often the business unit or the department or the campus or wherever you're going to define it. That's what it means. It acts as a business unit in its own, or a commercial center, or an independent unit, however you define it in the university. But it's accountable to its customer. In traditional centralization, it's corporate. Understand the difference? Shared services is, you should see a lot of service measures and metrics, continuous process improvement, that sort of thing. In centralization, it's usually because we want to cut costs, or we want to try and get visibility or control. Different emphasis. Service partnership agreements, or service level agreements, you might have heard them called. In shared services, service partnership agreements are widespread, understood, leveraged, used, managed to, etc. In centralization, you don't have them. Everybody just does what they think they should do, rather than what they have agreed they should do. Different. They're two different things. Classification, I mentioned this already, but shared services tends to operate as an independent unit of some description. In centralization, it's another corporate function again. And finally, responsibility. This is key, partnership. It's about a partnership, not a demarcation. And often you see in centralization over here, and you see this in shared services where it doesn't work properly, guess what happens? You get a them and us. Those people in shared services don't know what they're doing. They don't understand me, they don't understand the business. They're sitting up in that nice new office that they built. They don't get it, you know, right? And what the people in the shared services center, those people out in the business, out on the campuses, they don't understand what we do. They never follow our policies and procedures. They're always phoning up and shouting at me, right? That's a them and us. That's more centralization, or I should say, where shared services doesn't work. So quickly, some of the challenges and benefits of being decentralized there on the left. Some of the challenges you have, and you guys absolutely have this in the university system. It's prevalent in the public sector in general. You have disparate processes. Somebody put their hand up and tell me if I'm wrong, right? Disparate processes, multiple standards, duplication, things being done the same way in multiple different locations, different control environments, different technologies. We were just discussing this earlier. Different ERP platforms, the same ERP platform, but multiple instances of that ERP platform. Right? Those are the sort of things that happen in decentralized environments. Generally higher cost and not scalable. However, there are benefits, right? You're close to the business. You're supportive of the business of university when I say business. The business or the campus owns the decision. They control the decision points. There are benefits. There are customized solutions to meet business needs, operational needs. Those are the benefits. However, if you're centralized, what are some of the challenges? Oh, it's those people in corporate. You've got no idea what's going on. You're remote. You've got unreflexive and inflexible. You go home at 4:30. I'm always trying to phone you. You're not there, right? That sort of stuff. And shadow operations, which means there's stuff going on in the center and it's copied out in the business. That's what that means. But however, there are, in theory, two words I use a lot, in theory, a lot more common systems and support. What I call that I call that kidding yourself, right? It's where corporate says we have a standard SAP, Oracle, PeopleSoft platform, and then they don't want to hear actually what actually goes on outside corporate. Because out in the businesses, around the campuses, the locations, guess what? They're probably not using it anyway. They've got some side system, and they say, they pretend they're using it. When I joined 3Com, I remember Chris Paisley, the CFO at the time, said to me, Phil, we have SAP throughout our operation, 52, however, 60, 70 countries. And I said, that's great. And what's true? Well, we had SAP in our main sales and distribution locations, which were 3, 4. All the others didn't use SAP, or they had it upload into SAP. So we had multiple other side systems. So again, that's what I call a little bit, you've got to be careful with some of that. So we moved over time to a standard ERP system. And some of the benefits, obviously you have a tighter control environment in theory, and you have economies of scale in theory in a central environment. What happens with shared services? You see how we've captured the left and the right benefits, but you also get these benefits in the middle: highly client-focused, commercially driven, clear costs, flexible delivery, clear ownership, etc. So if done correctly, if implemented correctly, shared services can get the benefits of being decentralized and the benefits of being centralized and drive significant additional value. That's the point of this slide. That makes sense? Okay. Hopefully that's given you guys some background on what shared services is and what it is not. And it's about, remember, define it. Make sure you define it, make sure you understand it, and then make sure you implement it, and I'll come back to the implementation, to allow you and your team and your ultimate enterprise or institution to be successful. Because there's another saying I often say, I've heard this thing called shared services industry. Have you heard that? There's an industry in shared services. Ish. There's a practitioner of shared services, but shared services is not in business to justify itself. Shared services is there to support its core business, its institution. It's a service provider internally. Now, outsourcing, yes, is a business, but internal shared services should not forget that without the host organization, in your example, the campuses and universities, you don't have an existence. You're there to serve, right, ultimately. Now, I'll come back to why that needs to be two-way later, but remember that. So what's been going on in shared service? I've got a few slides. I think you guys are getting copies of all of these, so I'm not going to read them all. So I'll just pick out some key points. I often get asked, how much do shared services now? I'm going to answer that question, and I'm going to come back and say why it's not always good to start with this. But I often get asked the question, how much money do shared services save? Especially early on in public sector things, universities, governments. This is a data point, 20 to 50% of processes in scope is based on this HFS, it's Horses for Sources, PwC report. In my experience, it's usually somewhere between 20 and 40% is a good target, but that really depends on where you've started, how disparate you were first, what technology you've got. But you should be aiming for somewhere between 20 and 40. I've seen a lot more than that, and I've seen a lot less than that, and I'll come back to that later, but just a question. This is interesting. In today's business environment, 9 out of every 10 enterprises have shared services. You've got to be really careful with that data point, because you send a survey out, which these guys obviously did, and sent it to all these companies, and said, if the question's a yes or no answer, right? Does your organization leverage shared services? Yes or no? So I'm receiving that survey. Yeah, we've got shared services and accounts payable. I'll tick that. What does that mean? So you've got shared services and accounts payable, big deal, right? What about order to cash, record to report, what about hire to retire? What about procurement? What about IT? So be careful with that data point. The point is it's being used in 9 out of, whatever it was, 9 out of 10 every enterprise, but how prevalent it is, how broad it is, that doesn't actually tell you that. Yeah, a couple of other things. Technology. There are technology opportunities have grown substantially. As I said, I've been doing this for 20 years in shared services, more than 20 years. When we first started, you actually did have a lot of paper flow going around. I mean, the solutions around technology, document management, workflow, that sort of stuff are dramatic. And yet, I still hear so many stories of poor technology implementations in a shared services environment. And so you sort of think technology is so much better than it was 20 years ago, but still there's some of the same problems. And the reasons are because it's not the technology that's the problem. It's the way the technology has been implemented, rolled out, trained, and the change management and the cultural aspects of every organization. Yes, there are some better technologies than others, but really it's not the technology. I'm going to jump to the data point now because in case I forget later. But one of the data points I saw at a conference a year or so back, and I've seen it a lot in our own research, is that public sector organizations, especially universities, your spend on IT is more per user than benchmarks, i.e. you do not have a spend problem. You are not short of money in the IT historically. You guys have enough money on IT. You might argue with me, but in comparison to best practices, in comparison to the private sector, in comparison to best use, your organizations, and it's true in government as well, spend a lot of money on IT. The problem is how you spend the money on IT, how you roll it out, how you train on all of it, how people use it. That's the problem. The good news there is you guys, and this is a huge generalization, so I apologize for that, but when I say you guys, I mean the opportunity is there to use that money more effectively in a shared services environment and get much greater value for your institutions. That's great. You don't have to ask for more money. You just have to think about how you're going to use it. Actually linked to the data discussion we just had, right? You know, a lot of the data around spend is around technology, isn't it? There's plenty of money spent on technology. Let's keep going. So what else? Data privacy and security is a huge issue. I understand that, but it shouldn't be used as a reason not to move things from one location to the other. And one thing, we did a major project over 3 years at the government in New Brunswick, New Brunswick is one of the Atlantic provinces in Canada, population of about 1 million people, something like that. One of the things that constantly came up was how can you do, by the way, a brand new shared services center, multiple service lines, including initially accounts payable, payroll and benefits, IT infrastructure, IT service desk. Those were the first 4. There were a lot of discussions around data privacy and how can you possibly move stuff into a shared service center and keep data privacy, right? The truth is, you're absolutely right. That's a key consideration, key point. So you have to make sure that the systems are firewalled appropriately, the paperwork's done, but it's entirely possible. But what we actually found, as we did the review, how do you know that you've got that secure today? How do you know that what you're doing today is providing data privacy and data control? And in accounts payable, we found actually the control environment, when it was distributed, was far worse. And it's what I call the head in the sand thing again in corporate. If I don't know of a problem, I don't want to find it. And then when you make these things visible, we found that the control environment in situ was weak. And I found that at 3Com, I found that at Sendent. As soon as you go out there and start to try and centralize, one of the arguments is, oh, you can't possibly do it, you don't understand it, you don't understand the local legal statutory tax regulations. That was the classic one at 3Com. You don't understand Norwegian tax regulations. No, personally, I don't, right? But when we actually pulled it in, we found that even the Norwegians were not following Norwegian tax regulations. Why weren't they? Well, one, because a lot of them actually hadn't even updated themselves since they left school 15 years ago. So it's about understanding the regulations and then following them. So again, I went a bit of a tangent, but that really, really is important. So data privacy is huge. The other thing about shared services, for those of you that are already, how many of you guys in here already run shared services? That's sort of those half hands, which are really difficult to see. About a fifth, not a lot. But for those of you that already run shared services, you will know this. As soon as you move into a shared service environment, every mistake is huge, right? Previously, when it was in the business unit or in the campus or in the department, nobody heard about it, really, unless it was a real nightmare. When your shared services, oh my God, everybody knows about it. And it gets escalated. So you just be aware of that. I see some nodding heads, so I'm sure you've experienced some of that. So just be aware of that. That's not a bad thing for the institution, but it can be real tough for the individuals who work in those environments. In fact, there's a guy who worked for me once, a guy called Carl Barnes. He ran shared services for me in Europe once. And he said to me once, hey, Phil, you think you have a stressful life, right? I said, yeah, pretty much. I have to deal with he says, you should work in accounts payable for a week. He said the abuse this particular example, he said the abuse those ladies take every week is just shocking. And I said, and yes, it is. And it's unacceptable. And a lot of people in those shared services organizations take a lot of abuse, which is not fair and it's not right, right? But then you have to step back and find out why are they taking that abuse? What's the cause behind that? And then you have to go work with those people in accounts payable, in accounts receivable, in service desk, and find out what's causing it. Then you go back out to the client, the customer, and find out why they're angry. What is it that's causing that? And then you can start sorting it out. Anything else on here? Multifunction. There's a lot of good sort of general trend stuff that I'm not going to talk about. The second bullet, though, quick fixes. That's what I mean by the CEO on the aeroplane, quick fix type of stuff. Oh yeah, by the way, implement shared services. Tell me when you're done. Oh, lift outsourcing. Oh yeah, we had an outsourcer come in last week, said he could do all my, and this happened to me, said he could take all of your finance processes globally and do it 30% less than you can, cost-wise. I said, really? How does he know? And he went, and so I actually invited him to come in. And again, quick fix. The other things, technology quick fixes, shoving a new technology without thinking about it. There's so many quick fixes out there. That is not the same as quick wins. Quick wins are great. If you can find something that gets you momentum and buy-in and support for what you're doing quickly, great. And look in your project plan, look for those quick wins. And they're usually service-driven, where you actually do something that benefits the user and they enjoy, they think, hey, those shared services people really know what they're doing. They went out of their way to do this for me. And one example for me was in Canada. When I was setting up shared services in Canada, I'd already done it in most of Europe and the US. So I thought, if I can't do it in Canada, I should probably give up, right? And this is a long time ago now. But I was being told the whole Canadian operation was up in arms that we were going to put shared services in, and we were going to destroy the organization in Canada. And me personally, I was named personally, was going to ruin the business in Canada because we were implementing shared services. Pretty tough stuff, right? So I got on a plane, flew to Toronto, met the general manager, a guy called Nick, and he and I spoke. He brought in his finance people. Of course, all the finance people didn't want to do it, shared services, that is. So I actually asked everybody to leave the room, and I said one-on-one with Nick, I said, listen, we're not going to do any of that stuff. Why do you think I'm going to destroy your, why is it in my interest to ruin your organization? It's not. So let's go through what you're hearing and what we're going to do about it. And at the end of the meeting, I literally shook hands with him. I said, if you have any problem ever, you phone me. Just phone me and we'll deal with it. I sort of went at a tangent. After that, we implemented, as one of the first things we implemented, was an expense management system that got their expenses paid on time every 2 weeks, perfectly, with a proper receipt and certificate. They'd never had that before. It was always months, mess, wrong, late. And so from that moment on, I'm exaggerating a bit again, from that moment on, their sales guys loved us because they got their expenses paid. That was a great quick win, just as a bit of a tangent. Big data and analytics, you just heard a lot about that, so I won't talk about it, but shared services can help enable what you just heard this morning because you're starting to bring those systems and processes and visibility together. Okay, this is one of those classic charts. Over time, you can reduce costs. Yes, you can. I've already mentioned that. This one is the one I wanted to dwell on. This is actually a chart I'm going to update. I was having a chat with a few people this morning. I was looking at this again this morning because I sometimes use the same slides, right? And I thought, actually, you know what? In the private sector, this cost reduction, focus on cost, consolidate and standardize, reduce cost base, absolutely has often been the driver for private sector shared services. And to be honest with you, whether you guys agree or not, it has been a driver for the university system, CSU. You've had budget issues, you've had funding issues. How can you reduce costs, shared services? The problem is, if you start with that, you're going to fail before you even start, especially in the university system. You have to do this service stuff as well at the same time, not later. And I've learned that from working in higher education the last 3 or 4 years. If you just start off, if you lead with cost, you're already on the route to failure. And that's also true in the public sector. In the private sector, you could get away with that a lot more because you'd have some senior guy say, the CEO say, we will cut costs, like it or leave. I'm exaggerating a bit, but you get that, right? You cannot do that. You can have leadership, you can have guidance from senior people at universities, and you guys do, but if you lead on cost, you're on hiding to nothing before you start. So my point is, for you guys, this chart is sort of gone that way. You've got to do a lot more of this earlier, and probably less emphasis on cost, although ultimately, right back to my start, if you can't do it more efficiently, then don't do it. This is an interesting data point, again, from a Hackett study. This is a private sector more statement, but 100% of top quartile companies have shared services to some extent. That's not 93.6%, that's every single one. Now, private sector shared services has been around for a long time. A lot more chance to learn, and I'll come back to you on that. A couple more data points, but I've probably talked about those, so I'll move on. Public sector, let's get more specific for the public sector. Why? Why not? It's been around for 30 years now. It's been working, as I said, in the private sector for a long time. Ups and downs, good and bad, but why not? There are universities, significant funding issues everywhere, right? You've got restricted budgets just like everywhere else. In healthcare, same deal. In fact, healthcare, look what's happening in healthcare about costs and budgets and funding. So healthcare, this is a huge topic in healthcare, how to reduce back office costs. Same sort of thing. And some of the same basic challenges exist. They are different, and that's the need to apply and adapt and apply differently. But you don't know what we do, we're different. I tell you, I've heard that so many times, in so many places, over and over again. Everybody says they're different. But actually, as Brad said this morning, yes, you might be different, but at the end of the day, how the back office works is not that different, right? So what we're really talking about are the exceptions. And I'm going to come back to this in the best practice, but you know what, I'm going to say it now, because again, in case I forget later, the customer is not always right. In the private sector, you hear this phrase, which I think is sort of ridiculous a lot of the time, but the customer's first, customer's always right. No, they're not always right. Because if they're always right, I tell you what happens, you get a mess in the back office. So what do I mean? Hold on, what does he mean customer's not always right? If you go to a customer, this is absolutely true in IT, but it's true in anywhere else. If you're my customer, right? I go to you and say, we're implementing a new technology. How would you like it to be? How would you like it to look? Most of the time, pretty much people are going to say, oh, I want it to look exactly the same way it does today. I want you to do the process the same way. I want to be able to call you whenever I want about it, whenever I like. And I want you not to bother me. I haven't got time for training. And when you're done, give me a shout, and it better be cheaper. Right? That's what the customer wants. And that's human nature. When somebody comes and says something to you, you probably don't really want to change that much. What you should really be asking is, what do you need? Right? It's what do you need? It's what I call wants versus needs. And if you're in the back office, it can be hiring and onboarding somebody. Okay, how do you want that to be achieved? What's your timeline? Well, we want anyone who's hired to get their offer letter within 3 days. We want it to be approved by so-and-so. We want them to come in for a site visit on this day. We want to host them for this. We want their computer, laptop sorted. That's great. That's a need, isn't it? That's not just do it the way I've always done it because I don't want to change. So you go to the need. The customer's right on the need. Although it's interesting, again, we talked earlier on, I have seen this quite a lot. If you ask a customer about a need, then you actually get into implementing it. They go, did I really say that? I didn't mean that. I really meant this. And you say, okay, all right, we'll change a bit. So through this process, so don't just give them what they want. And why does IT cost so much often? Why they're back to that point? It's because one just gives them what they want. So you configure all the exceptions. You recode all the non-standard processes. Why are you doing all of that? Because it's easy. It's easy to do that without having to deal with the people stuff, right? You don't have to change anyone. And by the way, you think you're making the customer be happy. You might be initially, but you're actually making the organization more expensive, and you're actually making your customer unhappy whether they know it right now or not. Very important. Okay. Yeah, I've sort of touched on most of these, so let's move on. Yeah, I mean, I've touched on these, but shared services is now being discussed a lot more in general policy circles, because as a possible help to solution. I've mentioned a few countries on here, and in fact, we have done a bunch of, this is our research on maturity of shared services in public and private sector. And so we've looked at the US, for example. US private sector shared services, by the way, this isn't total science, it's directional. But if you had a scale of 10, where 10 is sort of, really private sector is leading practice, the US is clearly right up there, as is the UK in the private sector. A lot more still to do, so technically probably that 8 should be more of a scale of 8 to say 15 or whatever, but it's really based on best practice. The public sector in the US is has been slow to develop shared services. It's getting there. Department of Health and Human Services is a good example. I'll come back to some others. In Canada, conversely, the public sector shared services is really quite advanced. Any Canadians here? Probably not, but just thought I'd ask. No. The public sector shared services is actually really well developed up in Canada, but not so much in the private sector. There are reasons for that. UK public sector shared services. I heard the Spikes, right, from this morning, mention the UK Cabinet Office. I've worked with it, on and off in the public sector in the UK as well. And the public sector have been doing shared services now for 10 years, ever since the Gerson-Lehman report, for those of you that heard of that in 2004. They've had a bumpy ride, quite frankly, in public sector shared services in the UK, but they're still doing it, and they're making big strides. So if you're interested in reading about it, look up Gerson-Lehman, Gerson, Lehman, Lehman. I think that's how you pronounce it. Maybe an R in there. But Gerson-Lehman report, 2004. UK government's been at it for 10 years. They've done some good stuff, and they made some right mess of certain stuff. There's a great case study on how to do it badly. It's called the Research Councils UK, RCUK. Read it. There's some fantastic writing. I actually wrote a little article on it because it's what I call, when I eventually slow down and I finish my book, which I've started but I never finish, one of those, is one of the titles, or the main title is Hindsight Not Required. Hindsight Not Required. Because when I read this RCUK thing, I was like, really? You did it that way? Really? It's like, did you not learn from any of the lessons that have gone before you? It's things like abdicate the project to a third-party consulting firm, abdicate the technology, don't engage with your customer, don't do a business case, don't measure your baseline. Okay, you're going to fail 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Why did you wait? The more I look at this stuff, the more I sort of think, you know what, I keep saying people have got to learn lessons, but honestly, they also have to feel the pain. Because until you feel some of the pain, it's almost like you don't believe the lessons. Right? Now, is that the challenge and the opportunity for everyone and you guys is you don't want to have too much pain, right? So learn as many of the lessons as you can, but expect some pain. Because you can never do anything as best practice. There's no such thing in reality as best practice. There's a way, you go a direction, and you'll feel some pain. Just don't go that way and make a complete mess of it and feel so much pain. That's the key. All right. That's by country. I'll share it with you. You can see it later. This is an important one. Outcome of shared services programs in the public sector. Now, if this was a private sector chart, you would see a lot more in the, whatever that is, purple and blue, right? Strong positive impact greater than 20%, modest 6 to 20, minimal -4. Look at that big green bit on there. Now, what does this tell me? This tells me that the public sector is learning, right? Learning some of those lessons. It's struggling a little bit because I don't often see any charts in the private sector that have quite so much as severe negative impact greater than -20%. That means we really messed it up. That's what that means. So I don't often see that, but if you still drew a line halfway through the green, it basically says that more organizations in the public sector are benefiting from shared services than not. But it also tells me there are a lot of lessons that still need to be learned in the public sector. Not a surprise. That wasn't a surprise to me. I assume not to you. Why? Because you guys in the public sector higher education have only been doing this more recently than the private sector, so you've got more lessons. The opportunity, though, is why can't we learn those lessons and adapt them without just saying we're different? Adapt them to why you're different, especially, and I'll come back to that if I don't run out of time. I'm going to skip through some of these but these are some real examples of what's going on. This is the New York Metro MTA. They did a shared services project, pretty good, ridiculously expensive though. I won't put it on here, but they spent so much money. I won't tell you how much because it's probably not good news, but they spent a lot of money, but they've ended up with a good outcome. But they spent a lot of money, so they could have done it better in that sense, but good outcome. Here are some other examples in the public sector. So you've got PSC is the Program Support Center for the Department of Health and Human Services. You've got obviously NASA. Have you heard of the NASA shared services? It's actually put up there as a really great example of shared services. You heard of that one? Nope. It's a great story, so if you want to hear about it, let me know. There's some good articles on that. The Home Office in the UK I've mentioned. You've got the government of New Brunswick I've mentioned. There's a bunch of examples going on in the public sector. Government. Well, what's going on in higher education? Well, quite a lot actually. I've probably started talking about, there's a lot of research out there supporting the fact that the higher ed has to do something. The funding's not available, so why? If you don't have the money, what are you going to do? Are you going to cut students? Are you going to increase student fees? Or are you going to try and save money on back office? Well, ideally you want to save money on back office, right? Because that's not, while it's still mission critical, it's not core. So why wouldn't you? So there's a lot of research that supports that, and I've put some in these things like the Accenture. There's some other examples. And you can't just increase student fees. Tell me if you can, but you can't just keep continuing increasing student fees. So you have to find money from elsewhere. And of course, there is a difference between the private sector in a higher ed and public sector. The public sector, of course, gets grants. You guys get grants from government and state. Now, of course, with the pressure, I know California's been through like a roller coaster, hasn't it, of public sector funding issues. But in general, that's out of your control, and it's been cut a lot. So how do you find the money? How do you find the money to support your core mission? There's a Time magazine article in 2012. Again, I'll share this with you. This is an interesting Harvard 2011. I like this one. This is a summer on shared services in the public sector at Harvard. As shared services gains traction in higher education, more knowledge is needed on how to navigate the intricacies of introducing new governance models. I like this one. That's really important. The governance models. How do you interact with shared services? How do you interact with your governance structures in the universities? How do you interact with your campuses, with your faculties? Hugely important. So I wanted to call that one out. This is interesting because I know this has been commented on to me, actually. University of Michigan was moving forward with shared services and then it sort of stalled, right? I read that University of Michigan article on why it was stalling, and I was a bit of that hindsight not required going on in my head again. Because if you don't engage with the client, if you try and sneak these things in, I'm not saying Michigan did that, so be careful, but if you try and do these things without engaging your internal client, you might think it's easier. It's not. And the way I would describe it, you have to do the hard stuff up front. Because if you don't do the hard stuff up front, it will be a lot harder down the track. What do I mean? You know those classic design meetings, the business case design meetings, everyone comes together, has a kumbaya, says, let's all do these processes to make it benefit for everybody, but no one's really paying attention yet. And you might even have the wrong people in the room. We were chatting earlier on about this. One classic mistake here is you invite all the managers into those workshops and not the doers. The managers often, quite frankly, I've been a manager, you guys are managers, you honestly don't know what it takes to do transactions on a day-to-day basis. You need in those workshops the people who actually transact. I don't just mean in the center, I mean at the customer level. Who is making the request? How do they make the request? What's their frustration? Who is receiving that request? How are they processing that request? What is their frustration? Have the right people in that room. So that's the first thing. The other thing is you can have these design meetings, you can do all of this. You can say we're going to implement a new technology, but back to my analogy earlier, we're not going to bother you about that technology. And then what happens? You go live. And everybody goes, blimey, why didn't you talk to me? What is this you've just implemented? I didn't agree with that. Those processes don't work. Where did that come from? Oh, the project team's disbanded and gone away. Oh, we're operating now. Oh, no. You've got to get that stuff right, and that's what. And anyway, the reason why I raised that is the University of Michigan report. For me, they didn't really engage the client enough, and you really have to. Now, the flip side of that is you can engage the client till the cows come home, right? But you actually have to do something. And this is what I call collaboration for the sake of collaboration. I love that word, by the way. I heard it mentioned this morning, collaboration, the hug, group hug stuff. There's consultation. There's communication, consultation, and collaboration. That's what we call the 3 C's. Communication is, I'm going to tell you something. I'm going to let you know that something's happening. We are making a structural change in this service. This organization is now reporting to this organization. If you want this done, you need to do this. If you have any questions, please contact X. That's the communication, right? Consultation is, hey, we're thinking of reorganizing whatever, whatever. Can we get together and discuss how we're going to do that? Decision's already been made, right? It's just how you're going to do it. So you are consulting. Very, very important, by the way. Consultation is really important. How are we going to do this to make sure we meet your needs? Collaboration, under the true definition of collaboration, is what? You walk into a room with a group of people, you do not own the outcome, right? So whatever the outcome of that collaboration is, you have to accept it at the end of the process. Now, what significant change program do you think only does collaboration? It's very tough, because often there needs to be a framework, and that's the leadership. So just what I'm saying is consultation is important, communication is important, and collaboration within a framework. Without the framework, you never get anything done. And we had this at 2 particular clients, one way back in the private sector, one in the government in New Brunswick. They were collaborating and having meetings and discussions, and it went on for ages and months. And the particular one in the private sector, the leader had been collaborating and talking and discussing. And I went to him, his name was Nick, great guy, you can call him, you know. I said, Nick, have you actually done anything? I mean, you're out there talking to the clients and making them feel better, but I tell you, the one thing that's going to happen, the first time you screw anything up, when you go live, all that collaboration out the window. So you've got to collaborate, communicate. You have to do something. And that's to build, deploy. That's go live. Understand what I'm saying? Be very important. It's not just about the design and the collaboration. It's go live. Anyway, tangents. This chart's not mine. We borrowed it from a University of Canvas Shared Services website. Whenever I put this up, whoever's on here goes, that's not us. So we're trying to produce our own one now, actually. But you can see UC San Francisco. Anybody from UC San Francisco in here? Yes, I recognized a couple of you. Actually, we showed this up at the UCSF recently to your guys. And I know you're definitely further on than that. So whenever they did this, UCSF is much more towards implementation and next steps. But anyway, UC Davis, I know UC Davis is here. I won't go into detail, but it's just interesting. The point of this chart is that there's a lot going on, right, in the university higher education system. And just there are a few examples, private, public sector. Now with that, there is a lot of content here. I'm not going to have time, but I will share this with you. It's basically on here is a number of initiatives that are going on. So whenever anybody says to you, well, who else is doing what in higher education? There are some examples in here, so please feel free to use them. We've actually written a research paper on shared services in higher education, what exactly is going on in higher ed. So if you'd like to let me know, and we can send you a copy. But you'll see a few. Lawrence Berkeley, I mentioned that Yale's been doing shared services for quite a while. CSU's Procure to Pay initiative is on here. I know that's been around for a couple of years. Not too sure where you've got to with that, but still moving. Yeah, but it's on there as one example of what's going on. Thank you for the question. That's okay. University of California, UC Path. Anyone from UC Path here? Yes. Yeah, UC Path is another initiative. Actually, we've been down at your center working on the business continuity plan, as Mike mentioned earlier on. That's another initiative. None of this stuff is easy, by the way. I mean, I've seen the UC Path stuff work with UCSF. It's a huge project, UC Path. Absolutely the right direction, but there's so much involved in doing that, It's just, you've just got to make sure you do all the steps right, otherwise then you won't be successful. But if you do the steps right, great success. North Carolina, Cornell. The reason why I showed this one, look at this, projected savings for FY12, FY13. Look at the actual savings. 1800 versus 809, 1800 versus, oh, that doesn't look right, does it? I have to check that. But the bottom line is they're way below what was projected. I know that's correct. I think that slide got messed up. But the savings are way below what was projected. That's actually seen quite a lot of that in the public sector again, overestimating savings. Florida's doing a bunch, University of Kansas, etc. Right, in the 15 minutes, is that right? I got left. I'll keep going. What are some of the critical success factors for actually doing this thing called shared services? I've started talking about shared services, defining it, what it is, what it isn't, right at the start. Then we did some stuff on trends, general trends. Then we talked about public sector, what's going on. We focused a little bit more on higher ed, and now I'm circling back to what are some of the success factors. Whenever you do any sort of change program, people talk about people, process, and technology, right? Who's been watching that profit thing with that guy on TV where he talks about people, what's it, product, people, process? What's that name like? That TV program where the guy goes in and turns around companies. Oh, forget it. I'll remember it later. But he talks about people, product, and process. Whenever we're looking at shared services, it's process, technology, people, but the one that gets forgotten often is the client, the internal client I mentioned at the start. But they are all important. You see, there's a category against each one. I've talked a little about technology. I've talked about some of the people. You have to have the right people in place. They have to be trained. The processes do need to be standardized. They need to be standardized, but exceptions need to be noted and understood. Okay? Because if you don't know and understand those exceptions, guess what? The client will be unhappy, and they won't follow your process anyway. So you'll sit in the center and you'll kid yourself again that you've got a standard process, and you haven't. And when you remeasure it, your costs will have gone up, not down. So these are all the things. But by the way, if you understand an exception, think about that wants versus needs again. It's the need exception you're talking about, not the want exception. Key in the top left is client. What do we mean by client again? Client engagement. CIF means client interaction framework. You can call it what you like. Customer relationship management framework, account management framework, whatever you want. But if you don't have some sort of framework to deal with your client, you get this lack of clarity. You get perception is everything, right? Oh, I just heard last week that you messed something up, and before you guys came along and shared services, things were so much better. Really? What was that then? I don't know, but they just were. Why were they much better? So perception is everything. Perception is reality, by the way. So if people are saying that, it doesn't matter whether it's true or not, you've got to deal with it. But what you've got to try and do is find out what the reality is. One of the things is baselining. We talked a little bit about that. Focus on negative aspects. One-way traffic. The customer's not always right. In a situation where shared services are not working, you find that it's always everything's being blamed on shared services. They're being beaten up. And there's not enough pushback saying, hold on a second, you're telling me we're not paying suppliers on time. It's a good, easy example. We're not, you're right. Organizations not paying suppliers on time. Why are we not paying suppliers on time? You never, I'm exaggerating here, but not a lot. You never raise a PO, you never get approval for it, you send it to me too late, so we have to go and send it back. Then the goods and services arrive, we have no PO. By the way, the invoice which we asked to be sent here gets sent to you. You sit on it for 3 weeks, and then you send it to me. How is that helping me to deliver the output for you? So that's about the upstream partnership. And I could go on about that, but I don't have time. But that partnership, that input is critical. It's the two-way. And that's what you have is you have service partnership agreements, etc. All right. These are what we call the 9 key components of client interaction framework. There's a presentation, a session on its own. Really important. Again, I can share this with you and we can discuss it. But very quickly, top left is your classic account management. How are things going? Is everything okay? Anything I can do to help? Did we say what we're going to do? That sort of stuff. And then you've got some other areas. Performance measurement reporting is hugely important. Continuous improvement. How the client contacts with you. Those service partnership agreements I mentioned. Right away, we do not call them service level agreements. They are called partnership agreements for a reason, because you're supposed to be in this together, especially in internal shared services. Service level agreements tend to be with third parties, outsourcers, right? You shall do it this way, or thou shalt pay, right? That's a service level agreement. That's not a partnership. That means a service level agreement is, if you get it wrong, I'm going to blame you. It's your fault. You messed up. Told you you'd mess up. That's not, as opposed to a service partnership agreement, which is, hey, listen, I promise you I will do this for you in this way, in this format, during this time scale. But you need to do this for me. You need to send it to me in this format, in this way, on this time scale. And if I have a problem, I'm going to phone you, and you need to respond, please. But if you have a problem, you phone me, I'll respond. That's a partnership. You still have elements of levels in there, but it's a partnership. Very, very different. And that's the beauty of internal shared services. You can do that. Okay, in the last few minutes, these are just some of my own personal favorites from 20 years of doing this. Senior level, some of these tips and tricks you might want to call this. Senior level executive sponsorship is key. Absolutely. But don't totally rely on it. Be very, very careful. If you escalate everything that comes, before you know it, you've broken down your relationship with your customer again. It is all about the customer at the end of the day, ultimately, that word ultimately. But if things go wrong, and your senior executives, whoever they might be, do not fully buy into the program, it is tough, right? And I heard this, actually, this isn't a public sector either. This is a private sector organization that we were doing a global review of their worldwide operations, and they were saying every minor little thing that goes wrong in this company anywhere in the world, the CFO or the CEO gets a phone call. And that's just a culture of, oh my God, right? How can you work in that? So it's important that the CEO and the CFO support, but hold on, we've got to stop that. We've got to try and work out how to stop that every time something goes wrong, there's a phone call to the CFO or the CEO. That's not healthy for anyone. But it is important, but if the executive sponsors don't buy in at all, forget it. Or the other key is find at least one or two executive sponsors that buy in. So when we did CCE, Coca-Cola Enterprises, we had tremendous support from the corporate controller. Very, very important. We had a really great guy leading it from finance, and we had the CFO support. Without that, didn't matter how many times we had the discussion with everybody else, we'd never have got going. So you do need some level of support. Solutions versus quick fixes I've mentioned. Wants versus needs I've mentioned. Baselining a business case. Why would you ever proceed without doing a baseline business case? And by the way, sometimes the information is not available. I actually heard a great question this morning, and I think I got an analogy for that. Should you analyze everything to death and try and clean up everything before you start? No, you shouldn't. You should try and clean things up. You should try and get data cleansed. I heard that this morning. But should that stop you ever doing anything? The example in shared services is, should we, and I get asked this question, should we standardize, automate, and improve processes in situ first, and then move into shared services? Get asked that a lot. The answer is, if only that were capable of happening. It just does not happen. So I've been doing this a long time. It doesn't happen like that. You might get one or two that will do a nice job, but they'll do it completely different to the other one anyway. So by the time you move it in, so my point is, and I heard it with the data, bring it in, not straight away, not blindly, not without a proper plan, none of that stuff, but take what you get ultimately and then prove the value. And I heard that in the data, that I would echo what I heard this morning. I've mentioned communication, change management, this thing called change. I mean, nobody ever defines that, but what really change management is how do you move an organizational structure, way of doing things from one place to a new place? That is managing a change. That isn't, I'm just sending out ridiculous communications every 2 weeks. And isn't I stand up and take a Q&A. This is the other one. Communicate, communicate, communicate. What the hell does that mean, right? So no, communicate with purpose to the right audience in the right way, in an honest way, and answer the questions the best you can. That's not the same as communication. So one of the worst things I've seen in private sector is a 2-week communication session. I stand up, I haven't prepped, by the way, because I'm very busy, and I stand up and I say, any questions? And you get the question, well, what's going to happen to me? I don't know. What's happening week after next, in this particular, I heard this rumor that. If you can't answer those questions, that is far more damaging communication than saying nothing. So anyway, that's what I mean by change management. Change management is how do you move an organization from one state to another? There's all sorts of components to that, but think about it that way and it starts to take on a slightly different, and in the university system and in the research system, it's hugely different that you understand that. And that's where this, yes, we are different, absolutely applies, right? You are different. But how do we achieve the standard objectives with these differences? That's how you need to think about it. And then I'm sure you'll have a lot of pain on the way, but if you start down that track, you'll get there. Nearly there. Technology, one of my favorites. Technology is an enterprise system owned by the business. It is not an IT solution to be implemented blindly without any attention to business requirements. I mean, I've just seen so many of these implementations over the years where the IT organization thinks that they own the whole solution and just implements it. Now, to be fair to the IT organization, the business often doesn't want to be involved either because they think it's bothersome, right? The truth is that it's that coming together bit. It's the hard stuff. If you get that hard stuff up front, it's going to be a much better solution down the track. That's true of shared services, that's true of IT, that's true of anything, any change program. So don't just blame IT, is what I'm saying. It's not their fault if you don't actually ask to be involved as well. Because if you ask an IT guy, how many IT people in the room here, by the way? A few. If you ask an IT config guy, a programmer, here's a standard, we were chatting about this earlier, here's a standard solution, can you just implement it? Or you say to the same programmer, can you program this to meet requirements? Which one's they intellectually going to want to do? They're going to want to do the programming one. So what you want to do is you want to say, no, we'll work with you to come up with a solution that meets your needs. So again, you make sure you work with the right people in the right way. Not just IT, it's shared services in general. The 80-20 rule, don't try and meet every single objective. You won't achieve that. Anything else on here? Measures and metrics I've already discussed. Cleanse the data, I've heard that, I won't repeat it. Engage targeted expert outside help. Yes, but it does not mean abdicate the project to a third party. I mentioned that earlier. Do not do that. Don't let them run your show. But where you do need help, yeah, you should get it, whoever that might be. And this is number 18. The project does not end with go live. So often, we're gone live, cheerio, good luck. You need to think about post-stabilization support, and often that's because you run out of money, right? The budget's gone. So you get some person saying, oh, I'm sorry, you've gone over budget. Oh yeah, we've got to go live next week, and everybody disbands straight afterwards. That doesn't help. And then finally, shared services, I've been around for a while, I have the scars doing this thing. I love it. It's the opportunity and the value from shared services is huge. It can add so much value, not only to the organization, to higher education, but to the people who work in shared services. Some great people I know have come out of business units, come out of operations, and moved into shared service. They love the customer side of it. They love the interaction. They love the ability to make a difference. It is not a sweatshop. If it's a sweatshop, you've done it wrong. So just be passionate about it and be relentless, and you will be successful. That's it. Good luck. Thank you very much.